So then, we are back with the more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yeshayahu the prophet, we find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste for many centuries. As we read then Yeshayahu the prophet, the 61st chapter gives us very important, very specific, very precise understandings of the time of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, the holy feasts of the Creator himself. And then as we read and understand what the Holy Savior did for us, we can then establish what's going on in our time, times past, and also future. Let's then establish firstly what then Shaliach Shaul learned during his time of his pilgrimage. We do understand Shaliach Shaul was very strict in his learning, very important, because he studied under Gamaliel, very important Rabbi of the time. And then he was very acquainted with the holy instructions. Later on, the Messiah then did his duty, and then he ascended, and later on came then the understandings of Shaliach Shaul. He was then the very first, we might say, did understand as far as the holy feasts, and then these understanding of the future based from Leviticus the 23rd chapter. He was then the person that revealed closely these understandings regarding then the formation of the people and their understandings for then the holy cities later on came then via Yohanan, the first holy city on the land of Cush. And then you can understand later on what the others did, so then the people were more acquainted with the holy instructions. But then let's try establish then a point where then Shaliach Shaul was in Asia Minor. Now we understand Asia is a very prominent area of this world. There is a reason for it. Because during the time of the Messiah, when he spent his 12 months after he came from the dead, then he taught his people very precisely, step by step, feast after feast, and he explained very precisely, ever since Moses then recorded the holy instructions, and then his part, the part of the Messiah, regarding the holy instructions, and then he prepared them so they would form holy cities. As we read then what Shaliach Shaul did, firstly Acts 1:9, and then verse, you can start then with number 10. And these continued for a couple of years until who resided in Asia Minor, both then the Hebrews and Gentiles, heard the word of Yahweh, words the Holy Creator, and then the understanding of tabernacling. So let's then establish, very importantly, Shaliach Shaul not only taught the holy instructions during his time of leisure. Sometimes he worked. He was a tent maker. He was tending then tents, was involved with the secular work. But he was very prosperous as far as his work. Obviously, any person then teaching and then showing the holy instructions, they are always prosperous. Now, there are a few sections of prosperity. Some people, they only think on money. Others, they think on wisdom, understanding of the holy instructions, and most important, salvation. Because the Messiah said, what is for you if you gain the entire world and then at the end the soul is lost? Have to have a balance. And Shaliach Shaul also taught regarding trade, obviously because he was a person working for the secular world, and he was acquainted with the prophecies of Daniel. He truly was. When he was involved with teaching the people in Asia Minor, then many countries were, during the time of Shaliach Shaul, involved with these people. Some of them, for instance, in Romans, you find then at the very end of the Megillah of the Romans, you find then many people of many nations, they came to Shaliach Shaul asking for guidance. And this guidance was regarding trade, what to do with their kingdoms. Some of them came as women. And then he said, let every soul be subjected to those people, in other words, the people of the holy cities. Then they formed a very strong holy cities versus trade, and then they prospered. Then, not only this, but this trade learned during this time went east, because China was already on the land. They were doing trade for centuries. So then, we established these very precisely because not only these, the Polynesian people, people of the oceans, of the islands of the Pacific, they also received these trades understanding from Shaliach Shaul. That's why then, back then, the Pacific was the very large piece of water that was mostly involved with the holy cities, because from then on China was also a part of it. So as far as with understanding the world and the trade, or the first trade after the teachings of the Mashiach, it absolutely sure they came from the Pacific. If you read it, then you will understand, because Shaliach Shaul was in the Pacific, and then from then on his teachings went far away. So then, in 1009, you find then the destruction of the tomb from where the Mashiach came from. It was the first time the world made a declaration they did not want any more holy cities. Then there was a shift. The holy Miltha, so kept for those who were obedient, was then scoundrelized. Then you find a shift from the Pacific to the Atlantic. If you trace back, you understand 1009, no more holy cities, and then came the New World Order. So the enemy, very smartly, he shifted the whole understanding of Asia Minor and Pacific. He went to the Atlantic. Thus then the West began then its quest. 1009 was granted for Great Britain 800 years, and then US a couple of 100 years. Thus then the entire culture of the West on the Atlantic, you find then, was during the time of the deceit. And then we are learning the most powerful economy coming from the Pacific, because it started with Shaliach Shaul. And in his travels, in his teachings, he was showing the people they should be honest, they should trust each other, they should be responsible, they shouldn't lie, they shouldn't cheat other people, they shouldn't steal. And those trades, and then most importantly understanding tabernacling, was the very fuel, so they would maintain a very prosperous lifestyle. Let's then understand why the Pacific then is returning. As we understand time of the restoration period, you find very precisely then Daniel explaining the 12th chapter, and then you read in the 2nd chapter. Nations would try to adhere to each other, but they would not. So the whole understanding ever since 1009, the New World Order simply didn't work. So then the restoration period is pointing us towards the Pacific, where the trade went on as far as we can understand. And then Shaliach Shaul, you understand, in Northern Africa. They understand then Yohanan, it wasn't the first holy city. Then from then on, he sent then Megillas to those 7 cities in Asia Minor. That's how far he went. As far as we can understand, when we read those 7 cities in Asia Minor, these are precisely on Revelation. So it starts with there and then returns there. And then we are understanding the Atlantic has nearly no part in what Shaliach Shaul taught. As far as we can understand, the Pacific, mostly liars, group of nations from the time of the deceit, most of the nations bankrupt, and they do whatsoever they can to steal from somebody else. They lie, they cheat, they murder. So the enemy then decided to shift the focus from the Pacific, where then the very first teachings of Shaliach Shaul was there, towards a bit the west. Because in Asia Minor there is the Med over there, the northern side of it, but then went east, and then China was already doing trade for many centuries, and then the teachings went on, and then from then on went south in the Pacific and in India. So the whole hot area was truly the Pacific. And in the West we barely hear of the Pacific. There are some countries that don't even understand. So as the time of the restoration then is showing us, then the teachings of Shaliach Shaul, most importantly the teachings of the Messiah, and then the Pacific once again dominating the trade of the world. China already dominates 57% of the world's trade. And other kinds of partnership, it's simply the most powerful place in the planet comes from the Pacific. And the West simply is bankrupt. Brazil entered this very day in another crisis. The nation is bankrupt. The government simply destroyed. Then, let's understand this point. The Messiah taught during his time, and he completed the spring feast, found in Leviticus the 23rd chapter from the 1st verse through the 21st verse. The 22nd verse relates with the Gentiles. And then the autumn feast coming yet in the future. We have 10 plus 8 years left of this age yet. Then comes the autumn feast and the end of this age. But then as we read what the Messiah did, he came, he taught, he went down to the inferno, he was there in torment for 72 hours, then he came back. Very wisely, he didn't mention at first what he experienced while he was then in torment. Wisely then, he spent the next 12 months with his people, teaching them very precisely the holy instructions. He cleaned up the Torah, and there was prosperity on the land. Then, prior to his ascension, he began to reveal what he experienced down there. And he was thinking, don't bet your life in your riches, in your own capabilities. At the very end, when you breathe your last, if you don't understand tabernacling, it is straight down. The soul of your person goes to torment. And they did not like very much this. However, since there was prosperity on the land and he brought prosperity, then they had to hold their tongues. When the Messiah ascended, then began the persecution severely. They were persecuted, the people persecuted, and then whosoever was mentioning of his name, instructions given were destroyed, burned, and then the rest of the Shilishim, such as Yohanan, was then far away from the place. He ended up in northern Africa. That's how severe was the persecution. So then, later on came then the first 1,000 years of the Messiah, where the holy cities were around. And then came the 1,000 years of deceit, where then not only the Messiah himself was no more regarding holy cities, but then there was a shift from the Pacific, where then the leadership of the world's trade came from. And then the enemy brought the whole situation to the west on the Atlantic. And it didn't work, did it? The time of the Restoration period, we are understanding the Asians again, or the Pacific, many nations of the Pacific and their joining groups, they are then once again leading the world. Next time I'm going to evaluate then the covenant, so we can understand how Shaliach Shaul started, and then the first holy cities, and then what went on as far as the covenant, so we can understand Daniel the 11th chapter. Understandably, the 11th chapter, we are beyond the 7th verse, and then reading down, so then we can understand the covenant and the covenant. There are a couple of them, but one of them is false, and the other one is then the true covenant. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.